Well, welcome back, mates. Extremely exciting. Rudyard Lynch has returned to the podcast. He's the creator of the YouTube channel Whatifalthist, which, as of recording this, has over 320,000 subscribers on YouTube. His growth is on a steep incline. It was only a few months ago that we first spoke and he had just cracked 200,000 subscribers, and we commented there in our communication that it was only at the end of 2020 that he was at 100,000. So it's really amazing how quickly things escalate and sort of can get out of control when they start to compound on themselves. Whatifalthist is, of course, a alternative history, historical, and geopolitics YouTube channel. And it is all conceived and then created by the man who is the guest on this podcast, Rudyard Lynch. Rudyard is truly a sponge of history. He's so passionate and endlessly fascinated by everything that has come before us. Whether it is BC China, 20th century West Africa, or really anything and everything in between, Rudyard has somewhere between a peripheral and deep knowledge on the events as they've been recorded from all corners of the globe. It's so impressive and it's so fascinating, and I admire it so much in Rudyard. People listening to this who already follow Rudyard and listen and watch Whatifalthist already know how interesting his videos are. But if you perchance don't, then please plug Whatifalthist into YouTube and sit back and enjoy. In this podcast with Rudyard, you can expect to hear about some of the following: adventurers and explorers from ancient history, BC China and the mandate of heaven, the implications of bad demographics and sort of global negative birth rates, some hyperbolic questions from history, which I hope is a little bit of a fun way to end the podcast. And then finally, more and more and more, look at the timestamps and you're going to see all of the questions lined up there. But then that's it for an introduction, guys. Hang around to the end to hear my afterthoughts from the chat, as well as my ambition for the podcast. And with absolutely no further ado, here's the man himself, Mr. Whatifalthist, Rudyard Lynch. Mr. Lynch, thanks for coming back, mate.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure just like last time.
Cheers. I mean, we tried recording a few weeks ago, but my software just totally shit the bed. But I couldn't help but not repeat the most fascinating part of the Forgotten Chat, which was your commentary about this man, this Chinese man from around 0 AD, like a kind of a mythical figure. So talk to me about this guy.
Yeah, so last time we talked about Huang, and the man is known as the first emperor and basically the father of a modern unified China as it exists today. And he led the state of Qi, which is the one in the northwest of China, back when China was in a warring states period, when it was a lot of different little kingdoms that were fighting each other. And he was the guy who unified China and created all the legal and governmental institutions that China still has today. China is actually named after the state of Qi, where he was the duke or the king of Qi, and then he proclaimed himself emperor. And the man was just absolutely manic, where he did a lot of, I don't know how to describe him. So I guess the way to start would be he would take mercury to gain immortality because that was a custom and a magical thing of that time. And for those of you that don't know, mercury drives you insane. And so that manifested indirectly in a lot of stuff he did, where an example is the Terracotta Army, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, which is this giant underground army of thousands of people, each with their own individual faces and bought personalities, you could say that, with their equipment and stuff. And that was his burial ground. And we actually can't get to his actual burial because it was surrounded by a sea of mercury that the scientists or archaeologists are too scared to really go through. And so, because mercury is poisonous, at the same time, he sent he was obsessed with immortality. He was kind of like Hitler, where he wanted to build a totalitarian state that lasted forever. And back in that time, Taoist philosophy said that there was the elixir of immortality, and it was out into the East. And there's an interesting theory, actually, that centralized government showed up in Japan right when he sent a fleet out to the East. And the way he worked was that if you if you didn't get what he wanted, even if it was impossible to get that thing, so if you went out for elixir of immortality and you didn't find it because it doesn't exist, he'd have you killed. So these guys just sailed out to the east, and then Japan and the centralized Japanese government showed up right when that happened. And so it's an interesting idea that these guys just went east and made Japan rather than go back to China. Um, well, what else with that guy? He ran China as a legalist state. And for those of you that don't know, legalism is basically a philosophy where the core central tenet of it is that you are like a little toy soldier for your government's fantasy. They thought individuality is bad and the individual human should be turned into a little cog for the government. And so they also believed that human nature was inherently evil. And so they created a series of rules and policies that were just absolutely brutal. And so this man, I sometimes wonder if he was like reincarnated as Stalin in a later life, because he centralized the government. He he set up every village as a commune in which people had collective rights. So if one person in the village committed a crime, everyone else would be punished for it. And a lot of the laws were so absolutely brutal that an example was after his death, the government fell apart because the guy who led the revolution that took down the government, he had been instructed to bring food to an army mustering area and a military depot. And due to some flooding in the area, he arrived a little bit late, but the penalty for arriving late was death. And so he decided to rebel against the government because he was a dead man anyway. And so this was just an insane government that provoked no loyalty, but at the same time, it's the structure that all of modern China was built on afterwards.
So fascinating. This guy really, really didn't understand incentives at all. But I think the reason we got onto it in the Lost Chat was because of tying it into the Chinese idea of the mandate of heaven. So was there any layover between this guy and the creation of the mandate of heaven?
So Qixi Huangdi was like 200 BC. He was exactly the same time as like Hannibal Barca and the Roman Republic. The Mandate of Heaven was 1000 BC, so that's roughly the same time as like Moses and King Solomon. And the Mandate of Heaven was created because you had the Shang dynasty, and they're kind of like the equivalent of ancient Egypt, that era, and they were like a god king state where the emperor spoke to heaven, and he used his communication with heaven as his right to rule. And what happened was that the Zhou dynasty, who were Turkic nomads from the northwest, they seized control of the government, and they used the justification that the Shang dynasty had become morally corrupt and so no longer deserved the right to rule. And that's what the Mandate of Heaven is, for those of you that don't know. It's that in Chinese society, the emperor has the right to rule as long as he is like a good person and follows morality. And it's similar to what we have in Western countries, where actually John Locke, the philosopher who, for the American Revolution, where in the American Revolution they said that if that the King of England had voided his right to rule because he had disrespected life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that concept actually came from China. And the idea was that heaven gave the emperor the right to rule, and that once the emperor behaved in an immoral way, heaven would show its displeasure by having floods, rebellions, all that stuff, and then the population had the right to seize power.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that happened with Qixi Huangdi is that he's sort of like, best way to view him is like the Nazis or the Soviets. Some people where they were so obsessed with government power and centralization that they did away with all the traditions that their previous civilization had done. And so Qixi Huangdi hated the idea of the Mandate of Heaven because he wanted to rule forever. And so a part of that is actually the Mandate of Heaven was mixed into Confucianism, where Confucianism's China's top ideology / religion, and Confucius was like a super, super conservative. He's probably one of the most conservative philosophers in history. And so he took this older idea of the Mandate of Heaven and elevated it. And Qishi Huangdi was terrified of the Confucians and their learning, and so he basically killed every professor that they knew of Confucian philosophy, and then he tried to burn all the books in the country with the exception of those in medicine and agriculture. And so he just absolutely despised the concept of the mandate of heaven. And I mean, I guess the way it works is that he who despises and disrespects the mandate of heaven gets crushed by it.
Precisely. You mentioned 1000 BC China. That sounds absolutely fascinating. One doesn't even realize that there is 1000 BC histories of more countries than just say Rome and Egypt. Is there any records of like Romans or Greeks of the day traveling over to the east and then coming back with stories? Where are the great stories of the adventure?
This is actually really fascinating. I'm reading a book on Central Asia right now, and the Romans did know about China. And like we actually know of a Roman fleet that started in Egypt, sailed all the way to China, and met up with the emperor. The Greeks were far more involved in that part of the world, where the Greeks controlled all the trade in the Indian Ocean to India, to Africa, all that stuff. At the same time, a lot of people don't know this, there was a Greek kingdom in Afghanistan, and it was Greek
What year?
speaking. They had temples. Sorry?
What year?
Like
what date are we
300
looking
BC
at?
to 150 BC.
Okay.
Yeah. And they had this whole Greek society out in Afghanistan, and it was far more influential than a lot of people think, where they controlled the whole part of Central Asia indirectly, like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and also they invaded India, and they got as far as Bangladesh, where there was this guy Demetrius who conquered his way all across the north of India, and then died. And the reason no one's heard of him is that India before 1000 AD didn't keep historical records because they thought history didn't really exist and that time wasn't the process of history moving along was an illusion. And so before the Muslims show up, we don't have any records from India of actual history. So hypothetically, there could have been an Indian Genghis Khan in 700 AD and we would have never heard of him.
Man,
we probably would have, but we know a lot less about him than we'd really want to.
But how exciting is that possibility?
Yeah.
Just the other day. No, go on.
That's something I think a lot about, where there's so much stuff in history where once you, like, a lot of people view history as a single, like, you get their history of the world and it's a single narrative that starts with the Mesopotamians and then you get more of the Romans, a little bit on China. But until you really get into history, you don't realize how just crazy stuff was happening that you never hear about. And I just made my video on the genetics of prehistory, and there were massive wars and invasions and that stuff in the Bronze Age that we have absolutely no record of. Yeah. A great example is the Tollund battle, which we discovered this giant Bronze Age battle from like 1500 BC in North Germany with 4 or 5 different armies fighting each other, and we had absolutely no record that any of these countries existed.
It's crazy, isn't it? Some of the thrilling adventures that would have taken place that we have no record of. I was just the other day, did a podcast with a guy called Scott Rank, who's written a number of historical books. Maybe you'd be familiar with him, actually. He writes under the pseudonym Michael Rank. But one of them was the 10 Greatest Explorers and Adventurers of All Time. And they all were European, Arabic, or Asian. And they all sort of came from the Middle Ages. And I was like, and then the Age of Exploration. So the Middle Ages, the Age of Exploration. And I was thinking, and I asked him that it's obviously a consequence of record keeping that we don't have the amazing accounts like you just told, or the ancient Egyptian who made his way up to Scandinavia and then back, for example, or the Aboriginal who managed to walk through Indonesia up to China and return. Like, we don't have these amazing stories because of the lack of record keeping. Just imagine, maybe it was in the Library of Alexandria, who knows, but just imagine some of the amazing, truly inspiring travel adventures and exploration that we just don't know about.
There are a couple absolutely incredible ones that we do know about, however. Like, we know the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa around 200 BC, and we know the Phoenicians said they did that, and we know they did it because they had a couple accounts of southern Africa that there's no way they would have known about if they hadn't actually been there. Another example is there's the skull of an Australian Aboriginal in the Brazilian Amazon from like 7,000 years ago. And that's because the Australian Aboriginals were the indigenous inhabitants of Southeast Asia. And so apparently a group walked the whole way round.
Legends.
Yeah.
There was this guy, just to round out the adventurer chat. There's a guy called James Holman who who Scott Rank told me about, and I'm now reading his biography of him. This guy, fully blind, basically traveled to every corner of the planet, walked into a country not knowing the language and not knowing a person in it, yet managed to navigate his way around. And he wasn't a man of means either. He went in there with essentially no resources most of the time. And he was largely forgotten by history because even though he wrote books and was, before he went blind in his early 20s, a very celebrated Navy man for the English. He was largely forgotten because he sort of became this unbelievable caricature. Like, people wouldn't take him seriously. But then this guy managed to relive him. And I mean, it's just,
Wow.
You talk about an inspiration. Such an
Yeah.
amazing story.
What era was that?
This is the late 1700s, early 1800s.
Oh, wow.
So prime
So that
English
was when
exploration.
I was wondering if you're going to say like the 1950s, and just that adds a whole new degree of awesomeness on top of it, because I don't know, to get to China or something back in that era would have been a 6-month voyage, and now you can get to China in a 20-hour flight. And for a final note on absolutely incredible explorers, I'd like to drop that we think the Vikings might have gotten to Chichen Itza in Mexico, where there's a mural that they discovered that has a Viking longship, or what looks like a Viking longship, with wooden planks structured into it in a way that no Native American people did. It also has pictures of warriors with long shields, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and it shows them next to the boats. And this mural was made in 987 AD, which was within 15 years of when we know the Vikings went to Canada. And also, with the way ocean currents went, if a Viking off the coast of Greenland kind of got blown off the way, he could have ended up in Mexico. And that's just an absolutely incredible voyage that we just know nothing about. And I always think about how many of those guys there were.
100%. How many of those guys were there? Like, where is the account of the Aztec traveler who managed to make his way up north and mingle with the Native Americans? So many fascinating what ifs or whatever of history down that route. I want to return to China quickly, because I think this is quite a thought-provoking question, one which you're particularly suited to answer. How should we think about China as a communist state? So I was recently introduced to the idea of the mandate of heaven, which we've already alluded to. But then last week I was speaking with a guy called Jordan Schneider, the host of China Talk, who totally dismissed any notion of a modern day emperor and instead connected China's current Communist Party to its Leninist roots. Now, China is clearly a different type of communism to the Soviet Union. Only 30% of their economy is centralized. They don't ration utilities. The domestic economy is largely market-based, but still, communism is in the name. They are officially the Chinese Communist Party. So where do you come down on this, and how do you think about China as a communist state?
I totally disagree with him. I don't think communism is in any way apparent in how China currently operates. And this is an argument where I often run into people who are sympathetic to communism, because I'll compare communist states to other states across history, and that really pisses them a lot of them off, because I once called ancient Egypt socialist because massive centralized government control, a lot of similar economic policies, but it's not. It's very different political ideology. With modern China, my stance on that is that I made a video about Chinese styles of government, and there are generally three. There's the legalist, where Mao Zedong ruled very similarly to how Huang did 2,000 years later. The parallels, if you watch that video, the parallels are just horrifyingly striking. And that China goes into very totalitarian when they have to wage total wars. And so they have to pull on their entire population's loyalties. And at the same time, besides that, China's got two styles of regimes, one of which is the insulated conservative regimes that turn inwards, and then there are the external cosmopolitan ones that like trade more, and they're more likely to rely on Buddhism and Taoism, while the other insular ones are likely to be hard Confucian. And if you look at the progression of Chinese history in the modern world, it lines up pretty well with the patterns that we see from the medieval and the ancient world, where China was an insular Confucian state under the Qing dynasty, then it collapsed into a warlord period, and warlord periods happen all the time in Chinese history, where just different warlords fighting against each other. Then the warlord period ends like normally happens. Then China became a legalist state under the early communists. Then China opened up and had a externally focused trade-based regime similar to what the Chinese had in the early Middle Ages. So, like, the parallel for how China operates now is the Tang Dynasty, where you had like Persian and Islamic and Turkic sectors of the Chinese capital, where just a lot of foreign trade, that stuff. And so I think that I think looking at the previous parts of Chinese history are far more predictive than other communist states, because if you look at how the modern Chinese Communist Party governs as well, they're using institutions from before, like having the exams to figure out bureaucrats for the top governmental position. And it's closer to a monarchy than a lot of people would think, because every single leadership of the Communist Party since the beginning has either been Mao or a relative of a friend of Mao's, or part of Mao's buddies, or a descendant of one of Mao's buddies. And the final thing is, you don't see a lot of China has higher inequality now than any Western nation, which is, it's hard to say as a communist nation. And the modern Chinese Communist Party's got a similar relationship with capitalism as the way the Chinese have always been. So I don't really see any communist influence.
Interesting. I think it's such a thought-provoking question to hear answered different ways, because I imagine the case is that because China is branded as a communist party, it really distorts the way that people think about the country and conceptualize it as either a threat or a non-threat. Whereas if you could strike communism out of the name and China exists exactly as it does right now, we would be thinking about it very differently. I don't know what it is, whether it's some sort of hangover from all of the Soviet Union and after communism, that we sort of just describe all of the bad things happening in China because they are a communist state. But the reality is the subjugation of the Uyghurs, the police state, these aren't necessarily totally in line with whatever the communistic values are. And so it's kind of maybe some sort of propagandistic shield that they are unintentionally using. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I like hearing different ways that it's answered.
I mean, in general, I find ideology less important for describing countries than culture, where, like, Imperial Japan's often described as fascist, but I think fascism is a useful understanding for how Imperial Japan works, but also you need to look at how Japanese culture dealt with it, and Japanese culture's assumptions that it went into, because, like, the way I view Imperial Japan is it's almost like a feudal state where the officer classes were the descendants of the samurai. You have a god emperor, and it's a feudal state forced into a modern fascist country. And I mean, I think that's an issue we often run into, where, like, something I talked about in one of my recent videos is that places like Portugal or Latin America often have very similar policies to Nordic Scandinavian countries, but due to corruption and all that stuff, an economic policy that might work in Norway wouldn't work in Argentina, and they might have very similar politics on paper, but are carried out very differently due to the local conditions.
100%. Yeah, it makes more than a simple rule book of policies to create a prosperous nation.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated set of ingredients that all have to work together. Like, for example, I'm in Sweden, lived here for the last year. You know, I don't see any sort of socialism in their culture, although they do pay an exceptionally high tax rate on everything. But there is no sense within the Swedish people of trying to dodge the taxes or trying to avoid them at all. They're all, although this is getting worse, I must admit, but they all traditionally, and at least the boomers of Sweden and older, are all extremely content with paying whatever taxes the government asks them to pay. So because they do believe, and they do see in most cases, that tax money being turned into great public utility for them to consume. But then if the exact same policy happens in Argentina, like you said, the initial reaction is going to be, fuck the government. There is no way they have my best interests in mind. I'm going to do whatever I can to subvert this policy. And then, it falls in on itself before it even got going. So yeah, it's a complicated ingredient to create the prosperous country. Okay. China, Russia, Europe, Japan, plus many more all have negative growth rates. What are the implications of this, and how do you see the world's current demography issues playing out?
I worry it could be completely horrifying, and it's because we're getting to a tipping point where demographics can't fix themselves, where it's basically impossible for China to fix its demographics. And so aging populations become economic black holes. And the way that happens is that to support elderly populations have trouble working to support themselves. And so more money is taken from the younger people to support the elderly. That in turn slows economic growth because less money is being invested in the total economy, which means that in the long term, there's less, the pie basically shrinks. And as people realize the pie shrinks and there's less resources to make bigger pies, the pie continues to shrink. And also people have less kids because younger people can't have trouble affording to have kids once you have massive welfare programs. At the same time, your country loses economic competitivity. And so it's just a nasty cycle where computer projections, and I normally don't trust computer projections too much, say that countries like Germany, China, Japan are all going to have their populations halve in the next two generations or something, which just absolutely blows my mind. And none of these areas have any of the conditions that would allow them to have demographic growth, where people aren't marrying earlier, having more kids. The opposite's actually happening. Birth rates continue to decline, where in China, the birth rate went from one child per woman 3 or so years ago, and now it's at 0.5, which is, for a stable birth rate's 2 children per woman. And so that is just, it's beyond horrifying. And yeah, so it's really scary. And I think it's one of those things that people really need to talk about. And, but just it's difficult to find good solutions.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. China really is the poster boy for this demographic scenario, right? I mean, after the one-child policy, they had as much as 40 million more males existing within the populace because, unfortunately, the one-child policy, one of the most atrocious policies ever created, evil policies, meant that a lot of firstborn girls were either aborted or worse. So you have already 40 million extra men plus they suffer, like they have a completely shocking dependency ratio. All of these, there are more people that are going into retirement who need pensions to be paid for by the government from a much smaller pool of labor who is actually making any productivity to pay for those. So I think in the case of China's just going to kind of forget about their elderly, and they're going to make do with the very little that they end up having, and try and continue on. But it's bigger than China. It's also Japan. It's Europe. It's Australia.
Yeah.
What about the bigger implications of the global demographic issue?
Yeah. Peter Zeihan talks a tremendous amount about this, and he's a good writer where he basically sees all this demographic stuff and predicts what the trends are going to be with it. And I agree with Zeihan, and I agree with like what 2/3 of what Zeihan says. I disagree with 1/3. And what this means partially is that the countries with stable birth rates like the United States, Turkey, and even countries with birth. So the United States now is a declining birth rate, but it's declining slower than other countries. Or countries like France, where France and Sweden are the two countries in Europe that are in the best position to deal with this. And so those countries do better just because once you have less people who are purchasing in part of the economy, the world economy shrinks. And that's something that's absolutely crazy because we haven't dealt with a shrinking population since the 1400s. And it's not something we're used to in the modern world. And just the effects of this. So for one of my most famous things I talk about is the crisis of the 21st century, where I've the world experiences giant international crises that involve social collapses and the like every 200, 300 or so years. And you can find a bunch of variables that predict what caused these. And it's mostly human well-being metrics where once the average age of marriage gets past 28 or so, that's not a hard number. That there's a problem because it means people are having trouble naturally adjusting to adult. It means that there's more competition, so people are having trouble reaching the usual standards of what they expect out of life, which creates more social tension. The biggest predictive factors are too many people trying to compete and to get into the upper classes, and you see that today with massive university tuitions because universities can charge whatever price they want because at the same time, wage stagnation at the bottom level. And so those are the predictive factors. And at the same time, this is the horrifying thing, the aging and the population structure problems are happening at the exact same time. And I can talk about a bunch of other crises that are on top of this, like climate change, etc. But it just leaves an absolutely terrifying picture. And like China is a country I'm really worried about because everything we've talked about before, and I have a half an hour video talking about all I think about China's possible problems. And but I do wonder for China, are they just going to, and this is something that's so horrifying I don't even want to say it, will they just say past a certain age, will they just kill the elderly past a certain age if their population structure gets too broken? I mean, this is the country that's already doing horrifying things to the Uyghurs.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of what I was alluding to as well by saying they might forget about them. I'm not sure if they just actively, remove a giant part of the
Yeah,
population, but I think what's very likely is they could just very easily forget about them and say, hey, I know we
yeah.
promised you X pension, but we're not going to give you anything. Rely on your sons and daughters, or son
Yeah.
or daughter, as it's more likely the
With,
case. Um, I mean, it kind of just means a shift in the balance of power, right? So individually, for the countries that have the negative birth rates, they're going to experience a diminishing influence on the world stage. But there are also loads of countries that have that they're just booming birth rates. Northern African countries, as well as I think a lot of Central Asia and the Middle East. I think some Latin American countries as well. It could just spell a shifting balance of power on the global stage, with
yeah.
individual atrocities happening in certain countries. Um, you said you could speak about other things on top of it as well. With that in mind, uh, what is the most foreboding trend of the next 50 years?
So, last time I answered climate change, and hmm, let me think about that actually. I have two possible answers, one of which is climate change, where climate change is terrifying, and I'm not going to talk too long about it because it's a field that I get the impression it's an extremely complex field and I haven't studied it in depth. And so I'm not going to, I'm not going to do it any disservice.
I think climate, to understand and to create a accurate climate model,
Yeah.
is beyond the complexity of the best of us, which is part
Yeah.
of the major problem. Their models keep failing, so people don't believe what they say is true.
Yeah. And the problem with climate science is that the reason I'm wary of it is there's so many variables involved that I just don't know what to trust. Where, like, yes, you can map CO2 emissions over rising temperature, and that seems like a reasonable assumption. But also, temperatures were rising before the CO2 emissions started at a warmer degree than they are now. And um, there are multiple climate models that have very different assumptions, where there's tipping point models that basically say that once we hit a certain point that the climate's basically going to go to shit, where the Arctic will start to melt quickly. And then there are other models that are gradualist and say that, let's say Boston has a climate like Washington, D.C., and that's not going to be a tremendous destructor to society because we see shifts like that across history all the time. And I'm just going to say that I would probably put climate change as my top worry, but I don't think it's something that we can't solve. Where just the technological progress in green energy the last 10 years has been amazing, um, and I just think about what happened with the population crunch, where back in the 1970s, it would be reasonable to think this, looking at the statistical data at the time, that we'd have massive famine, and then the Green Revolution happened, and now we have 4 times the world's population with more food.
More food
Um,
than we know what to do with. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and we actually have 15% more yeah,
Mm.
15% better farmland, or 15% more forest land than we had in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
So I try not to be too doomer.
Mm.
And at the same time, I'm really, really worried about advances in military technology. Like, this is the thing that keeps me up at night, where I've read a good amount of science fiction in my time, and I just think about the worst possible weapons and torturing devices I've heard about in sci-fi. And a lot of that stuff is stuff we can develop in the near future, where um, giant death rays from like satellite-based weaponry, giant or tiny robotic remote-controlled assassins that you can't even see. And when I just look at our current leadership, I don't think I'm terrified at people that unwise having that much power.
But ever since America and the Soviet Union basically said, all right, it's mutually assured destruction if you're going to pull the button here, we've kind of been on the edge of that existential threat. And
Yeah,
I completely agree with you. I think it is certainly getting worse. I mean, you've got to think about the cyber implications as well, because it totally takes the personal risk out of an attack. You know, someone who's just sophisticated enough can bring down systems, and then all the second, third, fourth
yeah,
order effects down from that is actually what would bring you personal harm. But on the climate thing, I think I think it's worthwhile worrying about, but honestly, to a degree, because we can agree that there is too much carbon in the atmosphere, and that is because of human
yeah,
production. To deny that is then just totally going down the
yeah,
conspiratorial route. But because again and again and again, climate models and predictions fail us, it's hard for us to take it extremely seriously. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know really how to think about it. The complexity of trying to understand what the second, third, fourth, and fifth order effects are of, say,
yeah,
one extra degree of heat up between certain latitudes. It is complexity beyond the heads of really
yeah,
all of us. And we can agree that we should maybe try and curtail our carbon emissions, but we're doing a pretty darn expensive job at it already. I mean, you think
yeah,
about Germany. I wrote about this a couple of months ago, commenting on Bjorn Lomborg's work, who wrote the Climate Alert or something. Fascinating guy. Runs a Danish think tank called the Copenhagen Consensus, and he's a lefty, and he's not denying climate change, but he's looking at all the way that the countries around the world are responding to the climate change, and it turns out most of it is just for signaling value and buying whatever short-term votes you can get. Germany committed 40 billion euros over the next 5 years, starting in 2020, 40 billion euros to become carbon neutral. And it turns out that if Germany manages to do it, which is very unlikely they will, because they're carbon neutral, literally just means they're going to buy renewable energy from Denmark and Sweden, but themselves not change their means of production at all. It literally, even if they manage to meet this net zero, it would have the most marginal impact on the global temperature. That's essentially pissing away 40 billion euros, which could be used 100 better ways, particularly, like you say, for green tech. I was just listening to a podcast over the weekend where they were speaking about a carbon capture technology that can convert carbon into starch. I mean, what an amazing idea. I don't know how functional it is, but we can definitely envision ways where technological innovation will solve our issues. Anyway, but that's I've probably imposed my views too much on this.
The thing that really annoys me is, for a lot of it, we're not looking, or the traditional environmentalists aren't looking at the solutions that would be most effective. Where one of my friends is really into climate change, and he asked me, what would the thing you could do that would help the climate the most? And I said, shut off shipping from the Gulf of Hormuz, because India and China are both dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And so, I mean, you'd have to get them not use coal, but if those countries switch over to nuclear, which both of them are planning on doing at a certain point, and they are putting effort into it, then India, those two countries not doing coal, using nuclear, which would make sense strategically for them, would be absolutely amazing. Or just moving off coal to natural gas would have a truly massive positive effect on the environment, because coal is so much more filthy than anything else. Where the Keystone Pipeline thing, it's protested by a lot of environmentalists, but moving natural gas cheaply into the US would have a positive effect on the environment, because it would mean less coal.
100%. I mean, and you mentioned nuclear. That seems to me like a giant policy disaster from pretty much every country around the world, except Sweden and France, who use a lot of nuclear.
This is something that pisses me off, where it's another example of good intentions really backfiring, where we often overestimate the danger of nuclear power because anti-war activists in the 50s and 60s really overhyped it, where like a nuclear war between Soviets and America would not have wiped out the human race. It would have killed about 1 billion people, which is an absolutely horrifying number, but the human race would have kept going. And nuclear radiation, I was going to make a joke that Australia's wildlife can't get any weirder with all that nuclear radiation. But I mean, also, it doesn't have the horrifying effects then. It has a lot less horrifying effects than you'd think it would, because Chernobyl is one of the most biodiverse areas in Europe right now, because a forest grew on top of the old radiation area. And so, I mean, the cancer effects were often really horrifying. And if we had invested in nuclear starting in the 1970s, when it became less popular, the estimates I've seen on how much more efficient our reactors would be is just absolutely insane. Like, we'd be getting so much more energy for so much less waste.
If it was a preferred method of energy, then 100% the type of innovations we would have seen on the technology we can very comfortably make the assumption that it would be much more efficient, cleaner, and better than it is right now. To move on from predictions of the future, Rudyard, which we both agree is, whilst it's entertaining and fun to do, it is rooted on a bed of folly and sand. I wanted to ask you, last time we spoke, you said that I'm lucky my job has absolutely no accountability. So as your channel grows, you're now north of 300,000 subscribers. Are you starting to feel more accountable?
Yeah, I'm always horrified when people bring up the things I've said in the past. Yeah, I do feel more accountable because um, it's I just see the effects of what I do far more. Where if I do something ridiculous, it's going to be turned into a meme, which is ridiculous. But this is my full time job. I have to do it respectfully, and like I do consulting on the side for Whatifalthist, and it's just yes, I have a lot less accountability than a carpenter, where if the carpenter makes a bad chair and someone sits on it and breaks, it's immediately apparent the carpenter is bad at what he does.
Mm.
But yeah, as I get more and more, the channel size has doubled since we last talked. It definitely feels like I have to be more responsible. Like I was taking it seriously before, but I feel it more heavily now.
I think you do a remarkable job at managing that sort of pressure.
Thanks.
But give me an example of how you're feeling more accountable, or what makes you feel more accountable, apart from just the size of it.
Like, I mean, an example of this is that I've run into at least a Whatifalthist fan pulled me over on the street and just he saw my face off Instagram.
Mm.
When I briefly went to college for when I briefly went to college, someone in my class saw me or heard my voice in a seminar and pulled me over. So I'm dealing with Whatifalthist is bleeding more and more into my personal life. My future two of my future housemates for this winter are Whatifalthist fans, and I mean also like um I'm it horrifies me that I'm a 20-year-old, but I'm treated as like a respectable authority on all sorts of advanced academic topics, and the fact that that's the case makes me want it fills me with a sense of responsibility that
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to basically screw it up and let people down.
Mm. Yeah, you would hate for people to have their fears justified. Oh, of course, a 20-year-old couldn't actually live up to my expectations.
Yeah, I mean it's also I am more terrified of being right though. I don't want a giant I don't want wars to ripple across the world in the next 20 years.
Mm.
So if I turn out to be wrong and I end up being a crank, then that's better than me being right.
One more on sort of your personal life, and then I've written down hopefully some fun questions of history
Yeah.
that we can rattle off. But first, what is the most exciting and serendipitous opportunity that has come to you because of your YouTube channel?
I guess the most serendipitous thing is that I met a lot of my best friends through Whatifalthist, where my right hand man that I use for Whatifalthist, my right hand man that I work with and is my employee for Whatifalthist, I met him because he sent me maps of my own alternate histories better than the ones I had made, and we're gonna start being housemates in a couple months. Or another one of my best friends, who's gotten me a lot of my consulting business, he also DM'd me on Whatifalthist, and I dropped out of college and moved to Mexico with him for a couple months. So it's just a lot of beautiful life
Mm.
experiences.
So amazing, man. I think that's terrific. And it's only the beginning of the type of serendipitous opportunities that are going to fall in your lap. You know, yeah, of course, knock on some wood.
Unless the war doesn't happen, unless the economy doesn't crash.
Yeah, but then Whatifalthist will be lauded in history as the ultimate predictor, which, wouldn't be the worst thing. That's a form of immortality. But the idea of serendipity is that it comes to you in relation to how many nodes you're putting out into the universe. Like, how many
Yeah,
potential opportunities do you expose yourself to? And you going from 100K to 300K is not three times the amount of opportunities. It's 200,000 times the amount of opportunities. It
yeah,
really is. Um, uh, it's an exponential function, actually, the way that your serendipitous interactions can happen with the world. The more people you meet, the more subscribers you get, the more different topics you touch on YouTube, the more nodes you're putting out into the universe that could potentially return whatever that bliss is that you're thinking of. So um,
yeah.
that's the way I see it from the outside, actually, just looking
It's
at
also
what you're doing.
200 times the chances I get canceled.
Yeah, well, That's true as well. But don't worry, you just have to fight off the Indian army that always come after you.
Yeah.
Finally, Rudyard, some fun history questions, or at least I hope fun history questions. First, what is a country that has had a fascinating history that's largely forgotten about today?
I had a video series about this, and the country with the craziest history I've ever read about is Liberia, where it was a country founded by Ameri- ex ex African American slaves who created their own country in West Africa, and they in turn enslaved the native population a truly in a true tragedy. And then the regime fell apart because and the regime fell apart in a horrifying civil war. And this was a bizarre regime, by the way, where the president in the 1950s claimed descent from Harriet Tubman and was named something like Roosevelt Johnson. He had the names of multiple American presidents. And it was also sort of a puppet state by the American Rubber Company. And they had a crazy, crazy civil war in the 1990s when the old African American elite lost power, where one of the rebel leaders was General Butt Naked, who was who was a voodoo warlord, where he'd lead his troops naked into battle, and he thought he had magical protective abilities,
Yeah.
which allowed his troops to basically be able to ward off bullets. And he would sacrifice children, and then he turned to God when the Civil War was over, and is now a pastor.
Jesus Christ. They don't make them like they do in Africa, these insane tyrannical leaders. I asked you one or two casual hyperbolic questions last time we spoke, and I thought it would be quite fun to do it again. So without too much deliberation, just give me your initial thoughts on the following hyperbolic questions. And don't worry if they seem a bit absurd. It doesn't matter that much. History's greatest ruler.
I don't know. I'd probably go with Cyrus the Great. He single-handedly created the Persian Empire and was also just a really nice and humane guy. One of the smartest generals in history as well, where he just created one of the greatest empires of all time single-handedly. And also, he was tolerant to all the peoples he conquered.
Amazing. History's most misunderstood figure.
I'm actually making a video series about this where I have so many video ideas that just that I can't write them all in an expedient manner. But the figure that I think is most overrated in history, or I'm going to make a video on overrated and underrated figures. I think a really overrated figure is Louis XIV, where he's treated as this amazing monarch, where like one of France's greatest kings. In reality, he left France a broken state with massive debt. He squandered their era of being the wealthiest state in Europe. He got rid of the Huguenots and ended France's period of religious toleration. Got France stuck in like 6 or 7 wars that he lost every single one of them. So Louis XIV's reputation for being one of France's greatest leaders, realistically, not a good leader. And that actually happens a lot, where there's a lot of times where there's bad leaders who crest. The bad leaders are in good times, and they're associated with the good times, but they didn't actually do good policies. Ivan the Terrible is a similar example to that. And the most underrated figure in history, I'd say, is Al-Ghazali. He's the guy who switched Islam. Before then, Islam was a heavily rationalistic religion, where they said, by studying the outside world and science, you're understanding God. Al-Ghazali said, no, you need to just study the Quran. And if you read because God made the world, he can change what you see to the world at any time. So you need to read scripture rather than study natural laws. And that basically killed Islamic science, which had been prospering massively beforehand.
History's most important figure.
Jesus. It's tough between Jesus and Muhammad, where Christianity is a bigger religion, and also Christianity had influenced other religions like Islam, and like modern Western civilization is heavily Christian. at the same time, Muhammad was also a conqueror. And so with modern Western civilization, for example, you've got the Roman influence, you've got the Germanic barbarian, you've got the Christian influence. Muhammad effectively single-handedly created Islamic civilization. And so he built this empire, and he was a military leader, he was a jurist, he was a prophet. Like in Christianity, Jesus, it was just a purely ethical philosophy where Jesus just talks about how to be a good person. Muhammad created the legal code for Islamic society, the political system. So in Islam, like Islamic law dictates market regulations, business regulations, marriage, all that stuff. So honestly, I'd say Muhammad over Jesus.
History's most fascinating civilization.
I find reading about West Africa fascinating because a lot of the historical trajectory is so different from what you see in Europe, where like the Mali regime justified their right to rule through there being a serpent called the Bidda serpent. And once they stopped respecting the Bidda serpent, they lost the ability to mine gold in Mali, and that destroyed the state. And so it's interesting to read a 12th century history use magic to justify itself, or to justify its right to rule in a historical document. Or in the 13th century in Sunjata, the 13th century Malinese epic Sunjata talks about how it's like the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it's the Hunters Guild and the Blacksmiths Guild fighting against each other in a civil war. And because each of these guilds were independent tribes, and they were each believed to have their own magical abilities.
That is really cool. What was the second one? So the first one was Mali. What was the second country?
They were both Mali.
Oh, that's both Mali.
Malinese
Okay.
Empire. So it's the Sahelian civilization of like Mali, Songhai, those guys. Yeah, I always found those guys really interesting.
Yeah, no, that is really cool. And also today, West Africa is still extremely cool. The best warriors of history.
As a group, I'd say, damn. I want to say the Mongols. I mean, that just seems like an obvious example. I'm trying to see if there's an obscure, fun example that I haven't thought of. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go with the Mongols. They've just done the most by far.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I think it was 100,000 warriors they had at their peak, and they managed to control more land and people than any other ruling people in history before them or since. So
they must have had a population. Crazy. Yeah, I mean, exactly right. 100,000 warriors at the peak. Population of the empire must have been downwards of 200 million, which is just insane.
Insane. It was, I think it was from the distance of Russia, east to west, down to the Arabian Peninsula and through to China.
Yeah.
So unreal stuff. Finally, Rudyard, your favorite historical figure?
That's hard. I'd go with Harold Hardrada, who I think was really underrated. He, for those of you that don't know, he's the guy who died in 1066 before the Norman conquest, but he was the Viking guy who tried to seize control of England. And Harold Hardrada is like the real Conan the Barbarian, where he, at age 16, he lost the Norwegian Civil War, fled to Russia, became the lead head of the guard for the Russian military, then went to Byzantium, became head of the guard for the Byzantine Varangian Viking Guard, who was the imperial guard for them, protected the emperor and that stuff, won a series of campaigns for the Byzantines, formed his own mercenary camp, seized control of Sicily, went back to Norway, seized control of power, crushed his opponents in a civil war, and then launched an invasion of England, which nearly worked before he died.
What a gangster. I mean, what about it? Exactly. What about that as a legacy? It's insane. Finally, this is the last question. And last time you came on, you said Turkey as the country that you're most bullish on. So I just want to ask you again, and you can double down on Turkey if you like, but what is a country that you are really bullish on looking into the future?
in the first version of this, I said Ethiopia, and then the week afterwards, the rebellion of the Tigray in Ethiopia went really well, and they're approaching the capital. So I'm going to change that answer before it goes out public. Part of me wants to say New Zealand just to mess with you, but but I mean they're in a real all of the major countries in the world. All the like New Zealand's got a relatively stable population. They do fine with agriculture, and I mean agricultural exports are expensive now, but that's not a good answer, I think.
They're totally insignificant on the world stage, mate.
Yeah. The real answer is I'd go with France, actually, where France has the most stable of the European countries' birth rate. And also, a lot of people don't know this, France is a massive influence in West Africa, where they control the currencies of all those French-speaking countries in West Africa. They boot out leaders they don't like. France is currently fighting wars in 6 African countries right now.
Wow.
And they're the country that is like they're the least guilty after World War II, where the Germans would be terrified to use their military due to the legacy they've had. The French don't have any qualms about that. And so I think France is the country with the most leadership potential in Europe.
100%. That's a brilliant answer. And I think it's actually the first time France has gotten a response. 7th biggest economy in the world, 2nd biggest in the European Union after Germany, though I think the United Kingdom might be bigger than them. But they're
exactly the same.
They have...
Yeah, Britain and France have populations that are really close and economies that are really close.
Mm-hmm. And so, extraordinarily influential, like you said, throughout African geopolitics, I suppose, or at least African politics. They still manufacture stuff. They're self-sufficient agriculturally. They're in the middle of Europe. They're actually located extremely well done. They have such a long and proud cultural heritage and history. Really cool answer, and I'm totally with you. And also, you're in good company with Peter Zeihan as well. So, nice one.
Yeah.
All right, well, mate. Again, absolute pleasure, and I thank you.
As always, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Cheers, Phil. Well, there you have it. Rudyard Lynch. Thank you so much, mate, for joining. It was an absolute pleasure to sit down with you. And if you haven't yet, go and watch some of his videos. They really are unreal. It's such an impressive corner of the internet, what Rudyard has created with Whatifalthist. But if you've stuck around till now, then wow, you're an absolute legend, and cheers for doing so. I wanted to just leave this message with you. It is my ambition to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. But for me to corner any so-called market for eclectic curiosities, however that could manifest itself, it requires discoverability within the podcast algorithms. And as of right now, they are completely stuck in the Stone Age. It's terrible. Organic and serendipitous discovery of new podcasts is restricted to, say, guest appearances on other big shows, or if you somehow get on one of the recommended lists on Apple Podcasts or so forth. But basically, there's one variable that matters, and that is the amount of reviews attached to 5 stars that appear in the different distributions. So since that is the only variable that really matters, I would ask that you, the very dear and generous listener who has stuck around to this point of the podcast, whip out your phone and put in a generous 5-star review. It would be amazing. I really can't overstate how supportive that would be to me and also the podcast. And so if you are keen as a bean, do share this with a mate, pump your good juice into the algorithm, and have that pumped via 5 stars and a nice clean review. So thank you so much, and I wish all of you the best. I guess it's Christmas at the end of the week, so Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. You're a bunch of absolute legends. Take it easy. Gear up for a massive 2022.